Hey Dialectics, today we're going to be breaking down The Principles of Communism by Friedrich Engels. If you like these book breakdowns, like, subscribe, all that good stuff, and leave in the comments any other books you want me to break down and explain. And other than that, let's get into it. This, in my opinion, is one of the best books to start your journey in learning about communism because Friedrich Engels posts it as a question and answer series. So that's what we're going to do is go through the questions and answers and try to break them all down and make them more digestible because Friedrich writes more simply than Marx does, but some of the ideas are still fairly complex. The first question he asks is, what is communism? And the answer is, communism is the doctrine of the conditions of the liberation of the proletariat. And what this means, basically, to put it as simply as you possibly can, communism is the idea that working people should run the show, not the bosses or the billionaires. It means that ending private ownership of big stuff like factories, farmland, corporations, so that everyone benefits from what we all produce instead of just a few rich people. That's the basic of communism. Friedrich's answer here is the best answer you can find. Communism is the doctrine of the conditions of the liberation of the proletariat. And you've got to remember that. The second question he asks is what is the proletariat? Proletariat is that class in society which lives entirely from the sale of its labor and does not draw profit of any kind of capital, whose weal and woe, whose life and death, whose sole existence depends on the demand of labor, hence on the changing state of businesses, on the vagaries of unbridled competition. The proletariat, or the class of proletarians, is, in a word, the working class in the 19th century. And even today, if you get a paycheck, you're part of the proletariat. If you make your money by renting land or something like that, then you're a capitalist. The third question he asks is, proletarians, they have not always existed? Question mark. No. There have always been poor and working classes. The working class have mostly been poor, but there have not always been workers and poor people living under conditions as they do today. In other words, there have not always been proletarians, any more than there have always been free, unbridled competition. And what he's saying there is that it used to be during feudal lords, we didn't really have a proletarian class because people didn't receive paychecks. They actually just paid in rent. But they mostly, had access to the land and such. The fourth question he asks is, how did the proletariat originate? And the answer is, the proletariat originated in the Industrial Revolution, which took place in England in the last half of the last 18th century, and which has since then been repeated in all civilized countries of the world. The Industrial Revolution was precipitated by the discovery of the steam engine, various spinning machines, the mechanical loom, and a whole series of other mechanical devices. These machines, which were very expensive and hence could be bought only by big capitalists, altered the whole mode of production and displaced the former workers because the machines turned out to be cheaper and better commodities than the workers could produce with their inefficient spinning wheels and hand looms. The machines delivered industry wholly into the hands of the big capitalists and rendered entirely worthless the meager property of the workers, tools, looms, etc. The results was that the capitalists soon had everything in their hands and nothing remained to the workers. This marked the introduction of the factory into the textile industry. Once the impulse of the introduction of the machinery and the factory system had been given, this system spread quickly to all other branches of industry. The short version of what he's saying here, because this answer does go on quite a bit, but the very simple version is the working class has the power to change history, not just for themselves, but for everyone. By organizing and taking power, they can end all class oppression, not just flip the roles. Basically, what he's saying is the workers have all the power. They just need to exercise it. In question 5, he asks, under what conditions does the sale of labor of the proletariat to the bourgeoisie take place? Labor is a commodity like any other, and its price is therefore determined by exactly the same laws that apply to any other commodity. It is a regime of big industry or of free competition. As we shall see, the two come to the same thing. The price of a commodity is, on the average, always equal to the cost of its production. Hence, the price of labor is also equal to the cost of the production of labor. Basically, what he's saying is they will only pay you enough to make sure that you have enough to reproduce and keep the labor supply going. He also goes into why in different countries they'll pay different amounts because they only pay what it needs to survive in that country. So if it only costs you $5 a day to live in your current area, then they're only going to pay you $5 a day. But if it costs $50 a day to keep you alive and having children, they'll pay you $50. And that's basically the breakdown of the fifth question. Question 6 is, what working classes were there before the Industrial Revolution? The working classes have always, according to the different stages of development of society, lived in a different circumstances and had different relations to the owning and ruling classes. In antiquity, the workers were the slaves of the owners, just as they still are in many backward countries and even in the southern parts of the United States. Got to remember when this was written. In the Middle Ages, they were the serfs of the landowning nobility, as they still are in Hungary, Poland, and Russia. In the Middle Ages, and indeed right up to the Industrial Revolution, there were also journeymen in the cities who worked in the service of petty bourgeoisie masters. Gradually, as manufacture developed, these journeymen became manufacturing workers who were even employed by the larger capitalists. Basically, what he's saying is the beginning of the proletariat is when people started moving out of the rural areas and under feudal systems into capitalism, and that's where the proletariat came from. The seventh question is, in what ways do proletarians differ from slaves? The slave is sold once and for all. The proletarian must sell himself daily and hourly. The individual slave, property of one master, is assured an existence, however miserable it may be, because the master's interest is to keep him alive. The individual proletarian property, as it were, on the entire bourgeoisie class, which buys his labor only when someone has need of it, has no secure existence. This existence is assured only to the class as a whole. The slave is outside competition. The proletarian is in it and experiences all of its vagaries. The slave counts as a thing, not as a member of society. Thus, the slave can have a better existence than the proletarian, while the proletarian belongs to a higher stage of social development and himself stands on a higher social level than the slave. Basically, what he's saying is sometimes the proletariat can actually end up in worse conditions than slaves because there is no reason for the capitalist to keep you alive. If someone is owned by another person, then there's an interest for the slave owner to keep their property alive. But if all they're buying is your labor and time, then they only need it when they need it. And when they don't need it, you can just starve and be homeless. He's not advocating for slavery here, obviously. What he's saying is that the change from slavery to the proletarian wasn't that beneficial for the proletariat. It was more beneficial for the ruling class. The next question he asks is, in what day do proletarians differ from serfs? The serf possesses and uses an instrument of production, a piece of land, in exchange for which he gives up a part of his product or part of the services of his labor. Proletarian works with the instruments of production of another for the account of this other in exchange for a part of the product. The serf gives up, the proletarian receives. The serf has an assured existence. The proletarian does not. The serf is outside competition. The proletarian is in competition. The serf liberates himself in one of three ways. Either he runs away to the city and there becomes the handcraftsman, or instead of products and services, he gives money to his lord and thereby becomes a free tenant. Or he overthrows his feudal lord and himself becomes a property owner. In short, by one route or another, he gets into the owning class and enters into competition. The proletarian liberates himself by abolishing competition, private property, and all class differences. Question number 9 is, in what way do proletarians differ from handcraftsmen? In contrast to the proletarian, the so-called handcraftsman, as he has still existed almost everywhere in the past 18th century and still exists here and there at the present, is a proletarian at most temporarily. His goal is to acquire capital himself, wherewith to exploit other workers. He can often achieve this goal where guilds still exist or where freedom from the guild restrictions has not yet led to the introduction of factory-style methods into the crafts, nor yet the fierce competition. But as soon as the factory system has been introduced into the crafts and competition, and the competition flourishes, fully this perspective dwindles away and the handcraftsman becomes more and more of a proletarian. The handcraftsman therefore frees himself by becoming either bourgeoisie or entering the middle class in general, or becoming a proletarian because of competition. As in now more often the case, he becomes a proletarian. In which case he can free himself by joining the proletarian movement, i.e. or more communist movement. Question number 10 is, in what way do proletarians differ from manufacturing workers? The manufacturing worker of the 16th to 18th century still had, with but few exceptions, an instrument of production in his own possession. He owned the loom, the family spinning wheel, a little plot of land which he cultivated in his spare time. The proletarian has none of these things. The manufacturing worker almost always lives in the countryside and in a more than less patriarchal relation to his landlord or employer. Proletarian lives for the most part in the city, and his relation to his employer is purely cash relation. The manufacturing worker is torn out of his patriarchal relation by big industry, and he loses whatever property he still has in this way and becomes a proletarian. This is what's happened to everybody throughout the last 100 years. No one has their own means of production anymore. They've all been factorized and technology has made it to where you need to be part of the system in order to succeed. The 11th question is, what were the immediate consequences of the Industrial Revolution and the division of society into bourgeoisie and proletariat? The lower and lower prices of industrial products brought about by machine labor totally destroyed in all countries of the world the old system of manufacture or industrial based upon hand labor. In this way, in all semi-barbarian countries which had hitherto been more or less strangers of historical development and whose industry had been based on manufacture were violently forced out of their isolation. They bought the cheaper commodities of the English and allowed their own manufacturing workers to be ruined. What happened is things got so much cheaper by them using machines, they were able to produce 10 times as many shirts with half as many workers when they weren't sewing them by hand. And when they did this, it undercut all of the workers' labor price. So how much it used to cost for them to be able to, use you to make a shirt, now they need a tenth as many people to produce 10 times as many shirts. And they did this with everything. That's basically how you answer this. The 12th question is, what were the further consequences of the Industrial Revolution? Big industry in the steam engine and other machines. This means the means of endlessly expanding industrial production, speeding it up and cutting the costs with production, thus facilitated the free competition which is necessary bound up with big industry. Assumed the most extreme forms of multitude of capitalists invaded industry, and in a short while more was produced than needed. One of the consequences of mass production is that we always produce more than we actually need, and because of this, it allows them to control the flow of products and create scarcity when they want to and not when they don't, which is why they can make your TV cost so much less than your food. There's a reason for that. What follows from these periodic commercial crises, first, that through big industry in its earliest stage created free competition. It has now outgrown free competition. That for big industry, competition and generally the individualistic organization of production have become a fetter which must and will shatter. That is, so long as big industry remains on its present footing, it can be maintained only at the cost of general chaos every 7 years or so, each time threatening the whole. Basically, what Engels is saying here is that big industry, through its limitless expansion, is inevitably going to cause the boom and bust cycle, which is what happens every 7 to 10 years with our economy. It's why we have recessions every now. Recessions aren't an accident of capitalism. They're built into the system. And this is what allows them to buy up all the smaller companies during the downtimes and then make a bunch more money and then save it. And then when the downtime comes back again, they buy up a bunch of smaller companies and consolidate power. This is what they've been doing for the last 100 years. The 14th question is, what will this new social order have to be like? Above all, it will have to take control of the industry and of all branches of production out of the hands of mutually competing individuals, and instead institute a system in which all of these branches of production are operated by society as a whole. That is, for the common account, according to a common plan, and with the participation of all members of society. What he's saying is, we need to take the means of production away from the owners and give it to the workers. All of the working class should be deciding on whether or not we're poisoning our environment, on whether or not we're creating products that are dangerous, on whether or not we're creating products that are useless. The whole point is we should be making products the best they can be so that we don't have to replace them, but there's no profit in that, and we do this on purpose where we make things useless so they will be thrown away and you have to buy a new one. Just a waste of resources, and we could get rid of that. The 15th question was not the abolition of private property possible at an earlier time? The answer is no. Every change in the social order, every revolution in property relations is the necessary consequence of the creation of new forces of production in which no longer fit into the old property relation. Private property did not always exist. When towards the end of the Middle Ages there arose a new mode of production which could not be carried on under the then existing feudal and guild forms of property, this manufacture, which had outgrown the old property relations, created a new property form, private property. And for manufacture and at the earliest stage of development of big industry, private property was the only possible property form. The social order based on it was the only possible social order, so long as it's not possible to produce so much that there is enough for all, with more left over for expanding the social capital and extending the forces of production. Basically, what he's saying is that capitalism was necessary at the time, at the end of feudalism, because we needed a way to transfer the system into more larger hands. But capitalism's time is over because we've gone past that. We don't need capitalism anymore. We need to move on to a system that doesn't exploit the workers and destroy the environment and ruin everything. The 16th question is, will the peaceful abolition of the private property be possible? This is a big question. It would be desirable if all this could happen, and the communists would certainly be the the last to oppose it. Communists know only too well that all conspiracies are not only useless, but even harmful. They know all too well that revolutions are not made intentionally and arbitrarily, but that everywhere and always they have been the necessary consequence of conditions, which were wholly independent of the will and direction of individual parties, the entire classes. But they also see the development of the proletariat in nearly all civilized countries that has been violently suppressed, and that in this way the opponents of communism have been working toward a revolution with all their strength. If the oppressed proletariat is finally driven to revolution, then we communists will defend the interests of the proletarians with deeds as we now defend them with words. Basically what he's saying is that you can't make a revolution happen. It takes the economic conditions and lifestyle conditions of the people at the time to have a communist revolution. It needs to be something that everybody kind of does at once, and the communists need to be there well read on theory so that we can lead when everything starts going to crap. Question 17 is, will it be possible for private property to be abolished at one stroke? And the answer to that is no. No more than existing forces of production can at one stroke be multiplied to the extent necessary for the creation of a communal society. In all probability, the proletarian revolution will transform existing society gradually and will be able to abolish private property only when the means of production are available in sufficient quantity. Basically what he's saying is we need to build a separate subsystem rather than trying to flip a switch and take everything, because trying to do that is going to inevitably cause destruction of everything. The 18th question is, what will be the course of this revolution? Above all, it will establish a democratic constitution, and through this, the direct or indirect dominance of the proletariat. Direct in England, where the proletarians are already a majority of the people. Indirect in France and Germany, where the majority of the people consists not only of proletarians, but also of small peasants and petty bourgeoisie, who are in the process of falling into the proletariat, who are more and more dependent in all their political interests on the proletariat, and who must therefore soon adapt to the demands of the proletariat. Perhaps this will cost a second struggle, but the outcome can only be the victory of the proletariat. He didn't realize at the time that everybody was going to be proletariat very quickly. He kind of leaned to that, but now we're at the point where everyone is in the proletariat. Very few people are actually even bourgeoisie at this point. There's still the petty bourgeoisie, which are like, your small business owners. But for the most part, we're kind of screwed in this case. The 19th question is, will it be possible for this revolution to take place in one country alone? And sadly, the answer is no. By creating the world market, big industry has already brought all of the peoples of the earth, and especially the civilized peoples, into such close relations with one another that none is independent of what happens to the other. Furthermore, it has coordinated the social development of the civilized countries to such an extent that in all of them, bourgeoisie and proletariat have become the decisive classes, and the struggle between them is the great struggle of the day. Basically, what he's saying is socialism will never fully work until you can get every country on earth on board, because the capitalists have done such a good job at ingraining all of our markets and tying everything together that trying to do it in one country is going to cause the rest of them to rebel against you, and you're going to fail. The 20th question is, what will be the consequences of the ultimate disappearance of private property? The answer is, society will take all forces of production and means of commerce, as well as the exchange and distribution of products, out of the hands of private capitalists, and will manage them in accordance with a plan based on the availability of resources and the needs of the whole society. In this way, most important of all, the evil consequences which are now associated with the conduct of big industry will be abolished. There will be no more crises. The expanded production, which for the present order of society is overproduction and hence prevailing cause of misery, will then be insufficient and in need of being expanded much further. Instead of generating misery, overproduction will reach beyond the elementary requirements of society to assure the satisfaction of the needs of all. Basically, what he's saying is, instead of us using our overproduction to mass produce weaponry and $10 million yachts for rich people and bunch of stuff that only rich people get to use, we will use the overproduction to make sure that everyone has a house and food and medical care and the bare necessities before anyone gets $1 billion. Everyone else should at least have, a house. That's basically the short version of that one. Now, question 21 is, what will be the influence of communist society on the family? It will transform the relations between the sexes into a purely private matter, which concerns only the persons involved and into which society has no occasion to intervene. It can do this since since it does away with private property and educates children on the communal basis, and in this way removes the two bases of traditional marriage, the dependence rooted in private property of the woman on the man and of the children on the parents. And here is the answer to the outcry of the highly moral Philistines against the community of women. Community of women is a condition which belongs entirely to bourgeoisie society and which today finds its complete expression in prostitution. But prostitution is based on private property and falls with it. Thus, communist society, instead of introducing community of women, in fact abolishes. Basically what he's saying is it will not be anyone's business what you do in your bedroom, how you raise your family, any of that kind of stuff, but your children will be educated properly by the government. Community will make sure that the children are educated so that we don't have any dumb kids. Question 22 is, what will be the attitude of communism to existing nationality? The nationalities of the people associating themselves in accordance with the principle of community will be compelled to mingle with each other as a result of this association, and thereby to dissolve themselves, just as the various estates and classes distinctions must disappear through the abolition of their basis private property. Basically what he's saying is, once the community of proletariat are all working together, we can get rid of racism and classism and sexism, and all of those things would go away because we would actually be working together towards a common goal of making, humanity better. Question 23 is, what will be its attitude to existing religions? All religions so far have been the expression of historical stages of development of individual peoples or groups of peoples. But communism is the stage of historical development which makes all existing religions superfluous and brings about their disappearance. Basically, he's saying is that if we actually ever achieve full communism, religion will go away on its own because there won't be a reason for it. And I really hope he's right on that. Question 24 is, how do communists differ from socialists? The so-called socialists are divided into three categories. Reactionary socialists. The first category consists of adherents of feudal and patriarchal society, which has already been destroyed and is still daily being destroyed. Don't really have them anymore so much. The bourgeoisie socialists, the second category, consists of adherents of present-day society, people who have been frightened for its future by the evils to which it's necessary to give rise. What they want, therefore, is to maintain this society while getting rid of the evils which are inherent to part of it. Think centrist Democrats. And then there's democratic socialists. Finally, the third category consists of democratic socialists who favor some of the same measures the communists advocate, as described in question 18, not as part of the transition to communism, however, but as measures which they believe will be sufficient to abolish the misery and evils of present-day society. Basically, these are your Bernie Sanders types and things like that who think that, we just need to tweak capitalism around the edges. We don't actually have to change the system. Question 25 is, what is the attitude of the communists to the other political parties of our time? This attitude is different in the different countries. In England, France, and Belgium, where the bourgeoisie rules, the communists still have a common interest with the various democratic parties, an interest which is all the greater the more closely the socialistic measures they champion approach. Basically, he's saying this isn't really relevant as much today because he's just talking about political parties at the time. But you have to remember back then there were like socialist parties, communist parties were very prevalent in the politics at the time, and they would a lot of times join together to fight against liberals and fascists. The demands of the Communist Party in Germany: workers of all countries unite. The whole of Germany shall be declared a single and indivisible republic. Every German having reached the age of 21 shall have the right to vote and to be elected, provided that he has not been convicted of a criminal offense. This is basically the demands that the communists were trying to get put in before World War I. So you have to remember when this thing was written. And that is basically the breakdown of this entire book. Like I said, it's not very long. It's only 40 pages. If you're going to start reading any communist literature, this is where I would suggest you start before you dive into something like Capital or something like that. If you like this video, like and subscribe. Like I said, leave in the comments any other books you want me to go over. And thanks for watching, guys.